with us today doing the presentation is Austin Lemire Baton. He is the engineer for my unit. He's also the project manager and one of the key players in writing these new sets of regulations. So if you don't like him, his name's at the end. I did want to touch on just one thing as far as the single wall aspect. So this rulemaking doesn't have any effect on single wall. If you're here to um, request that we change change the rules and allow single walls, that's in health and safety code. The we did line this up with the single wall thing, and that was on purpose. We wanted to make sure that we had uh, the newest regulations with our new double wall world, and so there it is. But nothing in this changes the single wall deadline. That still is December 31st of this year. Get those things out of the ground or trouble follows. And lastly, and I guess most importantly, if you have questions, go ahead and hold those to the end. If you have a question about a particular slide, why don't you go ahead and just take that slide number down? It'll help us line up what you're talking about there, just to kind of clarify things. Or put it in the chat. I'll go ahead and mark the slide that we're talking about at that to assist us. This is the presentation is about an hour and 15 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, give or take a few. But we will be doing all questions at the end. So feel free to bring those as you need. And other than that, thank you all for attending. And Austin, please take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Tom, and thank you guys for being here to learn more about this Chapter 16 rewrite. A few disclaimers at the top. These regulations were adopted by the State Water Board at the September 3rd meeting, and they're currently under review by the Office of Administrative Law. That review will occur over the next couple of weeks. These regulations will become effective on January 1st of next year. That coincides with that single wall deadline that Tom had mentioned. We are preparing guidance documents and instructions for completing our new UST forms that are part of regulation. We'll be expecting those soon as well. And the UST violation library has been updated and is currently available for Coupa staff. Here's a look at what the new chapter, how it's organized. Obviously, when you remove all references to single-walled tanks and other past deadlines, that leaves kind of a hole as far as these different articles go. Article 1 will be our administrative article. This includes our definitions of terms, exclusions, and record-keeping requirements. Article 2 covers our site-specific variance procedures and procedures for requesting additional construction standards. Article 3 discusses certification, licensing, and training requirements for underground storage tank personnel. Articles 4, 5, and 6 are really the meat and potatoes of this rewrite that establishes the construction, monitoring, and testing requirements for all underground storage tanks that'll be regulated under these under this new chapter. Article 7 is our unauthorized release reporting and initial response requirements article. 8 covers closure requirements. 9 is our permit application, UPA requirements, trade secrets, and red tag requirements article. Article 10 discusses corrective actions and post-closure abatement requirements. And lastly, we have our appendices, which are our UST forms. Those are being updated as well. We've received some feedback in the past on how these forms could be improved, and we took those suggestions and went forward with them. So without further ado, let's take a look at our new Article 1. The first definition I'd like to discuss today is the definition for abandoned underground storage tank. This is a UST that has not had a functional release detection system for more than 365 days, does not have a current operating permit, has not been permanently closed or temporarily closed in accordance with the new regulations, and is not what we would call a decommissioned tank. Abandoned tanks, temporarily closed tanks, and decommissioned tanks all kind of look the same at first glance. We wanted to make sure we had a clear definition of what an abandoned UST was, just because they have different regulatory requirements than those other two classes of tanks. For example, these abandoned tanks will need to be inspected annually and before they are permanently closed in accordance with this chapter. Also, this definition plays a little bit into something we'll talk about later as far as tank reuse is concerned. More new definitions. We have the terms buried and unburied, and these two are coupled because we will no longer be referring to UST parts as above ground or below grade or any sort of that nebulous terminology. Moving forward, we'll be using only buried or unburied to describe where those components are. Buried meaning covered in earthen material or otherwise concealed from visual observation. We added this exclusion here in blue for emergency tank system piping that is within conduit going through building walls or ceilings if both sides of that can be visually observed. This was based on feedback that we received during our comment period and felt like it should be in our regulations just based on the issues discussed. For clarification, unburied will just mean able to be visually observed, basically the opposite of our term buried. Another couple terms that are linked together, we have continuity and zone. Continuity being the interstitial space within a zone that is open and testable and allows for the unobstructed flow of hazardous substances. Continuity is one of the key aspects of determining whether or not our secondarily contained systems are adequately monitored under these proposed regulations. If there's any sort of blockages or cave-ins, we can't say for certain if that interstitial space is, is being adequately monitored. Continuity will need to be demonstrated periodically as part of the release detection equipment certification, um, and piping will need to be constructed such that continuity can be confirmed. Zone is the interstitial space of a UST component that is monitored as a single unit. So this could be the tank interstitial space or the piping interstitial space. We're adding a new class of compliance inspectors to our proposed regulations. Independent compliance inspectors are individuals that perform compliance inspections on behalf of the Unified Program Agency with jurisdiction over a facility or the State Water Board. Independent compliance inspectors need to be independent of the facility that's being inspected, as well as the UPA with jurisdiction over that facility, and still meet inspector training requirements as part of our proposed Section 2634C. We want to make sure that these people who may be helping lower staffed UPAs meet inspection requirements are still qualified to perform those those compliance inspections. We're using the term submit pretty specifically in our proposed regulations, and it means one of two things. If the owner or operator is submitting something to the Unified Program Agency, that information needs to be electronically submitted through SWRS or other local reporting portal. All other submittals to the Cleanup Oversight Agency, so this being the Regional Water Board or your local oversight program, must be submitted electronically through GeoTracker. And later on in this presentation, we'll show some images of the new GeoTracker portal that'll help automate some of this communication. But know that when we use the term submit in these proposed regulations, it's through one of these two channels, either SWRS or GeoTracker. Any other information that needs to be provided rather than submitted could be done via hand delivery, mail, email, or fax. We have a bunch of, we have three different types of USTs in the proposed regulations based on tank install date, type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 tanks will be those UST systems installed before July 1st, 2003. Type 2 tanks being systems installed between July 1st, 2003 and July 1st, 2004. And our Type 3 systems being our tanks installed on or after July 1st, 2004. These tank types are delineated by dates that are consistent with health and safety code, so it made sense to have these definitions in our proposed regulations as well. We're also adding some violation classifications to the proposed regulations, and Unified Program Agencies, as well as the board, will need to use these violation classifications as part of their inspection and enforcement plans. We have Class 1 violations, Class 2, and minor violations. Class 1 violations being any violation that meets the definition of significant violation. And we have modified the definition for significant violation, but not in a substantive way. Basically, anything that is currently a significant violation will be a significant violation under the proposed regs as well, and therefore a Class 1 violation. Beneath our class 1 violations, we have class 2s. These are one or more violations that result in a failure to conduct or pass a test. It could be a release detection violation that's not considered a class 1, or it can be a minor violation. And for your class 2 violation to, or for your minor violation to become a class 2 violation, that minor violation would need to be chronic or committed by a recalcitrant violator. Having this graduated scale helps uh, provide a pathway for graduated enforcement so that we can see these systems return to compliance. At the bottom of our violation classification pyramid, we have our minor violations, and this is sort of a catch-all. This is a violation or combination of violations that don't meet the criteria for either a class 1 or a class 2 violation. Record keeping is also part of Article 1. These records need to be maintained for the life of the UST system. Installation, test results, manufacturer's checklists and manuals, and as-built drawings. This is all very important as far as looking back on the history of that system and seeing where something may have popped up that could be an issue that is making itself present later on. Those as-built drawings particularly can be very important to maintain for the life of the system in case there's any sort of repairs to the piping or structures of that matter. Additionally, we'll want records of repairs. So maybe you had a tank lining. We'll want the structural integrity certification associated with that. We'll need to keep those tank calibration charts as well as our unauthorized release reports. Those tank calibration charts are particularly useful for our overfill prevention equipment inspections to make sure that our OPE is being activated at the proper height. Electronic records that are readily accessible on-site during inspections will satisfy the requirement for on-site records. UPAs can still approve off-site record storage, but they need to document that approval and any conditions of that approval. Documents that are approved for off-site storage must be provided within 36 hours of being requested by either the UPA, board, special inspector, or independent compliance inspector. This does not apply to records that are stored on-site. Those are expected to be provided upon request. Approval for site-specific variances will need to be submitted via SWRS or local electronic reporting portal. Site-specific variances are very rare, so we want to make sure that we're adequately tracking them, and tracking them in SWRS seems to be the best way to do this. We want to make sure that they are consistent with our permit requirements as well as still in line with protecting the soils and groundwater of the state. Test notification. So this is also a part of our administrative article, but owners and operators will need to notify the UPAs in writing at least 72 hours prior to conducting a test unless waived by the UPA. And part of the reason we have it in this administrative article is so that UPAs can waive this without having to go through more formal procedures, as we'll see described in Article 2. Obviously, we'll want to still make sure that these UPAs are being notified, but they do have the discretion to waive that 72-hour requirement. So Article 2, our site-specific variance and alternative construction requirements article. This is a change here. We are requiring that the regional boards consult with the unified program agencies and the state water board during site-specific variance review. In the past, this has been only the purview of the regional boards. However, they have a tendency to reach out to us at the state water board anyway, just for additional guidance. And we have also looped in the unified program agencies as well to make sure that everyone involved is on the same page. And as we see in the second bullet, UPAs will still need to verify compliance with that variance before issuing or modifying an operating permit for that facility. So that also plays into that required coordination and consultation that we see in the first bullet point. For additional construction standards to include local ordinances, the State Water Board will need to investigate and hold public hearings for proposed local ordinances. Additionally, the board can modify or revoke authorizations if it's determined that those local ordinances are not required to protect the soil and groundwater of the state. Existing and future local ordinances will be scrutinized by the board and must be accepted before being implemented by the UPA. Part of this is we want to ensure that there's still compliance between the local ordinances, health and safety code, and the proposed regulations, and ensure that there's no conflict between these that could, lead to issues later on. Article 3 covers our training requirements for UST personnel. Owners and operators will need to submit the information that identifies their designated UST operator for that facility in SWRS. So right now, under our current regulations, we have an appendix for the DO identification. Moving forward in SWRS Next Gen, there will be data fields that will need to be filled out, providing very similar identification material. Tracking this in SWRS allows for better research and record pulling of these DOs, and it just seems to be a better system. Additionally, we're going to require that the name of the DO in SWRS must be identical to that individual's name on their ICC UST system operator certificate. In the past, we've seen issues with Jims and Jameses and seniors and juniors that have similar names, but they're not identical. And we just want to make sure that the people who are performing the duties of the designated UST operator are actually the people that hold that ICC certification. For the DO visual inspection report form, we will be requiring that the DO attach a dated release detection alarm history that's generated by the release detection system since the previous visual inspection. This will verify that that alarm log is consistent with the day that the designated UST operator performed their inspection. Now, if the release detection system cannot generate that report, the DO will be required to attach a copy of the facility's alarm log. This second point here is a pretty big change. So we're moving away from noting when periodic testing was last done to identifying when the next test is due for periodic testing. Historically, when we focused on when tests were completed historically, this has led to cycles of late testing because it's not always clear, or it's not always at the forefront of people's mind as to when that next test needs to occur. So, as we'll see when we cover the forms later on, that past due date is being changed to the next test due date. Installation or repair work, excluding release detection equipment that does not require excavation or backfill, may be performed by either a service technician or any individual that meets the licensing, certification, and training requirements for UST installation. The training and qualifications for service technicians and installers is not changing. However, the scopes of work for these two classes of UST personnel are being clarified, consistent with one of our local guidance letters that came out probably 2 or 3 years ago at this point. So this is being adjusted for clarification purposes. So the change on this slide is you'll see here that we have the phrase any UST component in italics, and under our current regulation, we spell out each one of these components that service technicians need a certificate of training for from the manufacturer. And you can't list every single UST component that a service technician could work on. So we're making this more broad by saying that any UST component that the service tech is performing work on will need to have that service technician trained on that component. Any individual that's performing installation or repair work or is working as a service technician will need to provide all licenses and certificates of training required for the work being performed upon request from the Unified Program Agency, board, or independent compliance inspectors. UPA inspectors need to obtain their ICC UST inspector certification within 180 days of when they begin to perform any of the duties of a Unified Program Agency UST inspector. This is a change from our current regs, which require those UPA inspectors to get their ICC certification within 180 days from the date of hire. However, they can perform Currently, they could still perform other non-UST inspection work. Bef I'm not explaining this well. Under our current regulations, they're required to do that within 180 days of being hired, even if they're not doing those UST inspections, right? So we're providing a little more flexibility under the proposed regulations by just requiring them to get that ICC certification within 180 days of when they begin to do UST inspector work. So this discusses that new class of inspectors, the independent compliance inspectors, they will be required to possess a current ICC UST inspector certificate and renew this certification every 24 months by passing the ICC UST inspector exam. Now, if they are currently employed as an UPA inspector and have satisfied equivalent criteria approved by DWQ's UST manager, they can use that instead. So, Article 4, this is where we start getting in the meat and potatoes of the tanks, piping, and release detection equipment. Let's talk first about our construction and operation requirements for USTs. All tank entries under the proposed regulations will need to be made through a manway, and manways will need to be installed per the manufacturer's guidelines, industry code, or engineering standard to ensure that they are properly installed and the integrity of the tank interstice is maintained. When you breach the primary and secondary containment, we run the risk of maybe damaging that interstitial space by either blocking it or crimping it down. And that leads to issues with continuity. And we want to make sure that we're maintaining continuity throughout the system to ensure that the primary and secondary containment are being properly monitored. This slide is for tanks that are installed on or after July 1st of 2026. They need this industry stamp within the perimeter of the sun collar. A lot of this information currently is located on the nose of the tank. However, obviously, when that gets buried, a lot of this information is no longer visible. So we will be requesting on tanks installed on or after July 1st of 2026 to have a label that shows the manufacturer ID, production location, date of manufacturer, max burial depth and test pressure, and openings that do not have a striker plate, if any. For tanks manufactured on or after July 1st of 2026, the manufacturer will be required to provide documentation to the owner that confirms that the manufacturer has verified continuity within the tank interstice. Documenting this from the manufacturer demonstrates that the tanks were built properly and helps serve as a roadmap later on the road if continuity does become an issue in that system in the future. We can kind of go back through our records and see when that issue may have occurred. This slide is a new requirement, but is likely already a best business practice in the industry. Steel piping that's installed on or after January 1st of 2026 will need to be factory coated black steel that meets ASTM A53. Again, we want to have a minimum containment requirement for our steel piping that we currently don't have in our existing regulations. We'll be requiring minimum Schedule 40 thickness for our primary containment piping and for our secondary containment piping, Schedule 10 thickness. For tanks that are installed on or after January 1st of 2027, so a year after these regs have been in effect, will need to be anchored to prevent flotation using methods specified by the manufacturer, industry code, or engineering standard, or in accordance with an engineering spec approved by a California registered PE. Now, operative word here is being anchored. We want these tanks physically attached to the ground to ensure that they cannot float. Our current requirement under the existing regulations is for tanks in areas of high groundwater. And as we've seen in the past, if we have a tank pit open during construction, even in areas of low groundwater, if a storm event comes through, a lot of times those tanks can float, and that is an expensive fix. Moving forward, we'll be requiring that these tanks be anchored at installation, all of them, so that they can avoid that costly repair later on. Any water that's used to balance tanks during construction needs to be completely removed and disposed of to the satisfaction of the Unified Program Agency. We want to make sure that the UPAs have not, or that installers rather are not overwhelming municipal water systems, or if for whatever other reason there's restrictions on how to dispose of ballast water, we want to make sure that it's to the satisfaction of the UPA. We're requiring that UST systems be repaired only after approval from the Unified Program Agency. This second bullet here is a pretty big change. Single wall direct buried spill buckets that require replacement must be replaced with a secondarily contained spill containment. So if you have single wall direct buried spill buckets and they fail and need to be replaced, that will need to be replaced with a secondarily contained spill containment. All of our other components on our UST systems at this point will have secondary containment. We would like to bring our spill buckets up to the same standard. For non-integral secondary containment components that use isolation as a form of corrosion protection, any repair made to that component as far as corrosion is related needs to confirm that that component is isolated from the backfill. Basically, if we look into something, we see that there's rust on the inside. We don't want to just simply patch that or spray over it. We want to have to, and this may require some additional excavation, but we'll need to verify that that exterior of that non-integral secondary containment still has isolation on the outside, right? So even if we just patch that internal repair, that may not fix the underlying issue of maybe a breach on the outer side of that secondary containment. Next, let's talk about some monitoring requirements. So we're making some changes to the monitoring site plan. This will need to be a scaled diagram, and it will need to indicate the layout of tanks, piping to the extent known, and containment sumps. Obviously, there are old and convoluted piping layouts, so to the extent known aspect can be determined by the UPA. We will also require locations of all release detection equipment be identified. And if you have a Type 3 system, which is our VPH system, we'll require that each vacuum, pressure, or hydrostatically monitored zone be on the monitoring site plan as well. This requirement for a scaled diagram, as we see in that top bullet here, combines the requirements for our site map and for our monitoring site plan. Now we'll have it in one document instead. Here's a couple changes to our response plan. The response plan will need to demonstrate that any unauthorized release will be removed from the secondary containment as soon as practical. Right now, the requirement is for not more than 30 days. However, there's no reason that the hazardous substance should remain within that secondary containment or the interstitial space for more than, a handful of days. We're also adding a requirement for emergency contact information, as well as the ID and 24-hour phone number for continuously staffed emergency operations centers for facilities that are remotely monitored. We want to make sure that unauthorized releases or any emergency associated with that can be addressed in a timely manner. So release detection equipment can only be disabled by a service technician with notification to the Unified Program Agency. This proposed requirement changed after feedback received during our comment period. Originally, we were going to require that disabling release detection equipment only occur after approval from the Unified Program Agency, but obviously testing, replacement, and repair can be time-sensitive work. So we have changed this since then to just be a notification to the Unified Program Agency to keep them in the loop. For interstitial monitoring release detection equipment that is going to be or is expected to be non-functional for more than 24 hours, the owner will have to implement an alternative monitoring program. This will include physical monitoring of the secondary containment at least once every 24 hours, but the UPA can make that a more frequent physical monitoring interval. The results of this need to be recorded within the facility's monitoring log. Now, if that release detection system is expected to be non-functional for more than 30 days, the owner or operator must put that system into temporary closure. This is not just for a sensor or a line leak detector that has gone out. This is if that entire monitoring panel that kind of governs the whole release detection system goes out. If that will be out of commission for more than 30 days, that system will need to go into temporary closure. This next slide talks about remanufactured equipment, which is not quite addressed in our existing regulations. We patched it up a little bit, but remanufactured release detection equipment can only be remanufactured or rebuilt by the original manufacturer, and it will still be subject to the same third-party testing that all new equipment is subject to. We want to ensure that even if we're remanufacturing or rebuilding these components, that they're still held to the original standard as they were when they were third-party tested for compliance within California. This slide is a big change. We'll be requiring mechanical release detection equipment that continuously monitors our UDCs. This includes the impact shear valve. If those fail to function on or after January 1st of 2026, they cannot be repaired. They need to be replaced, and they need to be replaced with continuous electronic release detection equipment before the system can resume dispensing. Too often we've seen these float trips fail during inspection, and then um, the dust and grime will be cleaned off of them, and they'll be adjusted in some other way to be passing, and then they'll pass that one time, and then the next time there's a test, they'll fail. To us, this demonstrates that these components don't effectively monitor the under dispenser containment. So if they fail, they got to be replaced with this continuous electronic release detection equipment. This bars emergency tank systems. So for all other tank systems, starting July 1st of 2026 that have pressurized piping and are not routinely staffed, those systems must have a continuous interstitial release detection system that stops the flow of hazardous substance when a release is detected from the piping or if the system malfunctions. The idea here being if you have this remote facility with pressurized piping and there is a release, that pressurized piping can quickly overwhelm our secondary containment that we have on site, and you know that leads to a very large issue. So for those facilities, we'll be requiring that the release detection system shuts off the flow of hazardous substance if there's a problem with the monitoring equipment or if there's a release from the piping. This is tied to our definitions of buried and unburied. Excuse me. But under our current regulations, we say that line leak detectors need to be installed on underground pressurized piping. Moving forward, this will be buried pressurized piping. So maybe there are some systems where this definition change plays a larger role. That may require some systems be retrofitted with a line leak detector. Buried pressurized piping that's monitored by continuous VPH release detection systems that shuts off the flow of hazardous substance through the piping when a release is detected or when the release detection system malfunctions will satisfy the line leak detector requirement. Basically, what this means is if you have a fail-safe positive shutoff VPH system, that will meet your line leak detector requirement. VPH systems are very high precision and can make line leak detectors redundant on some systems. Piping that is VPH monitored needs to be configured to facilitate periodic testing and confirm continuity in each zone to the extent practical. Again, this comes to the UPA on some of these more outdated convoluted systems during the testing of release detection equipment. So release detection equipment will be required to be tested every year. That piping will need to have continuity confirmed on it each year as part of that certification. Remote monitoring, this is a new definition that we've added, but I've decided to talk about it more in our monitoring article. Basically, remote monitoring needs to allow for immediate notification of a facility employee or a service technician. We know that remote monitoring is already being used under our current regulations. We're just adding this to set a minimum standard for what we mean when we talk about this. Owners and operators of facilities that are remotely monitored will need to document in the facility monitoring records when an alarm is received and when a response action is taken to satisfy the remote monitoring requirements. Article 6 covers testing. First slide, we're reducing the ELD test results submittal deadline from 60 days to 30 days. This is consistent with other submittal timeframes of other testing reports, and there's no reason to have ELD test results take longer than 30 days, and oftentimes they're available much more quickly. This is a big change. We're getting rid of the test hierarchy for spill containment, overfill prevention equipment, and secondary containment. Basically, under our existing regulations, you're required to use the manufacturer's guidelines for testing these components. If there's no manufacturer's guidelines, then you can use an industry code or standard. If there's no manufacturer or industry standard, then you can use a PE developed standard as approved. Moving forward, each of those will carry equal weight. The idea here is that we can improve flexibility for some of our more complicated systems, or if there's test methods that are more cost effective or result in less system downtime that still test the components as stringently, uh, then we would like to see those be used in the States or in California as well. Test equipment will need to be calibrated and maintained in accordance with the test equipment manufacturer. So, for example, the line link detector test box from VMI is required to be sent into the manufacturer either every 2 or every 3 years to make sure that it's in proper working condition. Obviously, our um, release detection equipment is only as good as our test equipment is. So we want to make sure that our test equipment is in proper working order. Now, if no manufacturer's resources are available for this test equipment, we will require calibration by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, or what most people do under our existing regulations is to just replace the equipment. Documentation demonstrating that the test equipment is in proper operating condition will need to be made available upon request by the Unified Program Agency. Again, we want to make sure that our release detection equipment is being adequately tested by our test equipment. This kind of goes back to our monitoring article, but secondary containment, testing, and release detection equipment for VPH monitored piping must verify continuity between the sensors and the most distant points in the zone as approved by the Unified Program Agency. This will help verify that there's been no breaches or cave-ins, etc. That'll limit the monitoring ability of that release detection equipment. This is a big change, but it affects a small subset of tanks, or rather systems. Line leak detectors that are used for performing annual line tightness tests, so that 0.1 GPH at 150% operating pressure, will need to be tested with the simulated 0.1 gallon per hour leak at 150% operating pressure. Currently, those line leak detectors that are performing these annual line tightness tests are only being tested to, or only verifying that they can find a 3 gallon per hour at 10 psi release. We want to make sure that they can find this 0.1 gallon per hour. This will not apply to Type 3 USTs, our VPH systems. It will not apply to lines that are tested by a licensed tank tester, and it will not apply for UST systems that have piping equipped with fail-safe interstitial monitoring. So it's a big change for a small set of UST systems. Article 7 discusses our release reporting. So we're changing the title of the owner and operator's initial report that they send to the Unified Program Agency to the preliminary written report for clarification in the reporting side of things. We're also requiring that this preliminary report include the facility address as well as the facility ID number to help better track releases. If necessary or if required by the UPA or COA, the owner will need to remove any remaining stored hazardous substance within that UST if it's had a release to prevent either further releases to the environment or to facilitate corrective action. The UPA will be required to submit preliminary written report data to include sample analyses or other data. Um, they will be required to submit that to the cleanup oversight agency, again, your LOP or regional water board, within 60 days of receipt from the owner operator. The cleanup oversight agency will then review all that documentation submitted by the UPA within 30 days of receipt. Um, as we'll discuss in our Article 8, we do have this GeoTracker portal that streamlines a lot of this communication with automated emailing as far as like, I've received this, send it to this person, um, which can be populated by SWRS ID among other details. So here's what that looks like. Sorry, this is our Article 8, our closure requirements. So here's what that new GeoTracker portal looks like. I believe it's already up and running. Basically, you can input your facility SWRS ID, and then from that, it'll populate a lot of the information on these fields here. And when you submit this form, depending on the individual submitting it, it'll provide it to um, the next required step in that communication, I guess. Here are some new requirements for temporary closure. The owner and operator must receive approval for temporary closure prior to initiating temporary closure. Uh, this these requirements are being added to the temporary closure inspection requirements. So we'll require that the owner operator verify that the tank is inerted. If applicable, the UPA can waive the tank inerting if they see fit. They will need to document the results of this inspection and make inspection documentation available within 36 hours at the request of the Unified Program agencies. And these temporary closure inspections will occur every 90 days. For permanent closure, we will require that permanent closure procedures be completed within 365 days from when that system is no longer storing hazardous substances from the date of approval by the Unified Program Agency. Um, it would be unreasonable for permanent closure processes to take longer than 365 days, which was how we developed this window of time for a permanent closure. We added this to regulations to ensure that these systems going through this process don't languish and are closed and have no more issues associated with them. We're also making some changes to our sampling requirements for permanent closure. So soil sample collection needs to be performed immediately after removal of the tank or hazardous substance piping from the excavation. This is critical because a lot of what we store is volatile and we want to get an accurate representation of what has leaked into the soil in that event. Same thing goes for groundwater sample collection. That needs to happen immediately after water enters the excavation or is otherwise encountered. We've updated our our sampling requirements in this regard as well. Soil samples will need to be taken a minimum of 2 feet into native. For tanks that are over 12,000 gallons in capacity, we'll require an additional midpoint, or we'll require an additional sample at the midpoint of the tank, as well as the samples at each end of the tank. And for compartmented tanks, we'll require a sample at each internal bulkhead. For hazardous substance piping, we'll require sample collection every 20 linear feet. And for rigid piping, at each change in direction. So if you have an elbow or a T, we will want to see a sample taken at that location as well. Additionally, we'll require sampling taken under each dispenser. As part of the closure report items, we'll want to see site maps or drawings that identify the location at the facility, depth below grade, and the date each sample was taken. If there's boring logs associated with the closure report, we'd like to see those as well. And lastly, we'll want to see documentation that demonstrates proper disposal of the tank and hazardous substance piping and any sort of um, any other hazardous waste. So copies of manifests signed by the receiving facility or um, receipts of recycling. The information on this slide will need to be provided from the Unified Program Agency to the Cleanup Oversight Agency as part of the permanent closure process. UPA name and contact info, facility SWRS ID, name, address, owner information, SWRS tank ID for each tank that's closed, date that the system was closed, volume in each tank, previously stored hazardous substances, sample information, closure inspection reports, land and lab analyticals. Within 60 days of receipt of that documentation, the UPA must issue an UST closure letter to the owner or operator that confirms that their system is closed in accordance with these regulations. Um, this is a good step to really ensure that the owner knows that no additional work is required on their part for their UST system. That UST closure letter will need to include the facility SWRS ID, name and address, owner name, tank ID, type of closure, is it removed or is it closed in place, and name of the cleanup oversight agency that has jurisdiction over it. So reuse. This is new to our regulations. If there's a tank that's intended to be reused to store non-hazardous substances or is moved from its current location to be reused for any purpose, needs to first be permanently closed prior to being moved or reused. This is all contingent on approval from the Unified Program Agency. Owners and operators will need to provide the following information to the UPA within a time frame specified by the UPA before that tank can be reused. This information will include the name of the new owner or operator, the location of the intended use, the nature of the intended use, and approval by the UPA with jurisdiction over that facility where that UST will be reinstalled. Relocated tanks that will be reused to store hazardous substances must be tested, inspected, and recertified by the manufacturer, as well as an independent testing organization, no more than 30 days before installation. They will also need to have their ITO label updated to include both the original manufacturer date and this recertification date. Additionally, all of these tanks will need to meet the requirements of 4, 5, and 6 as well as Health and Safety Code section 25290.1. Basically, any of these tanks that are being reused to store hazardous substances will need to be a type 3 UST. We understand that this is a high bar. However, we find that this is essential when you're taking a tank out of the ground, moving it somewhere, and then reinstalling it. There's, a number of instances where something could damage that tank. We want to make sure that it is in the best operating condition it can be in before it's being placed back into service. So for abandoned tanks, this kind of ties into the reuse. They cannot be placed in temporary closure and must be permanently closed in accordance with these regulations. However, they can return to operation if they are equipped with VPH interstitial release detection systems, as well as pass an enhanced leak detection test. So if you have an abandoned tank and it can be upgraded to be a VPH tank and it passes an ELD test, then it does not need to be permanently closed. All right, permit applications. UPA requirements, trade secrets, and red tags. So this first change is consistent with our existing practice, but the permit holder for these tanks needs to apply for renewal of that permit at least 30 days prior to that permit expiration date. This helps prohibit a lap or sorry, this helps prevent a lapse in coverage from the UPA and provides UPA sufficient time to review before issuing that new permit. This information is required to be added to the operating permits issued by UPAs. They will need to identify the UPA that's issuing the permit, the facility name and address, the name of the UST owner and operator, and the permit issue date. This additional information facilitates record keeping and ensures proper tracking and enforcement of permit requirements. Both the Unified Program Agency and the State Water Board must initiate enforcement action against owners of non-compliant UST systems that's consistent with an inspection enforcement or I&E plan developed and implemented consistent with Section 2694. This I&E plan needs to be consistent with Title 27 and will promote effective detection, abatement, and deterrence of violations and provide a clear path forward as far as graduated enforcement is concerned and improved tracking of action and communications between the UPA and then owners and operators of non-compliant systems. Here kind of covers what I already covered, but that I&E plan needs to be adopted pursuant to Title 27, include procedures for compliance inspections and other inspections associated with installs, modifications, repairs, and closures, and verify and document return to compliance based on information provided or submitted on behalf of the owner or operator by conducting follow-up inspections, and have procedures for progressive enforcement actions initiated against owners and operators. So these I&E plans will be required to use minor Class 2 and Class 1 violations and include procedures on how to elevate those violations accordingly. Again, this plays into that last slide. Both the UPA and the board need to classify violations as either minor, Class 2, or Class 1. Language has been added to this section as well to specify that the board can also red tag facilities. This is done for clarification purposes. And part of this is if the board does take any action to red tag a facility, the State Water Board is required to notify the UPA that has jurisdiction over that facility in writing within 24 hours and continue to consult and coordinate with that Unified Program Agency until the red tag has been removed or that UST has been properly closed. Having this communication really helps support, getting these tanks back into compliance and making sure that the UPA is, as well informed. If the board applies a red tag, the board can request that the Unified Program Agency perform any required inspections or authorization duties, such as removing the red tag. This ability to delegate red tag duties helps promote prompt return to operation for those facilities. Both the UPAs and the board have the authority to direct a UST operator to empty a red tag facility. That owner must do so within a time frame determined by the UPA, not to exceed 48 hours from when that red tag was affixed. Red tagged tanks cannot be emptied through the dispenser. Writing specific language regarding this to prevent owners of non-compliant facilities from profiting during non-compliance. Again, red tag tanks cannot be emptied through the dispenser. If the owner removes a red tag pursuant to authorization from the board or UPA, the owner will need to document the level of stored hazardous substance within the tank immediately after removing the red tag and return the red tag and provide documentation of the level of stored hazardous substance to the agency that affixed the red tag within 5 days. This red struck out text here is kind of an artifact that's consistent with the rest of how we're talking about timeframes within these draft regulations, but we're moving away from business or working days and just calling them days. This industry seems to operate 7 days a week anyway, and everyone has a different definition for what a business day is. So we're moving away from that. All right. Corrective action requirements. Only cleanup oversight agencies, so your local oversight program or regional quality control board, have the authority to oversee abatement of unauthorized releases of hazardous substances from underground storage tanks. This helps resolve any conflicts between UPAs and COAs during cleanup activities and clearly establishes who is responsible for what during corrective actions. Um, Owners and operators can perform interim remedial actions during the preliminary site assessment phase if there's a imminent threat to human health or the environment. If they go this route, they will need to notify the cleanup oversight agency that has jurisdiction over their facility. Any free product at the site will need to be removed to the maximum extent practical as determined by the cleanup oversight agency. And the free product removal report must be submitted within 45 days of release confirmation. So, um, when the owner operator submits a corrective action plan to the cleanup oversight agency, that cleanup oversight agency will need to concur with or otherwise direct changes to that corrective action plan within 60 days of submission from the responsible party. Responsible parties must modify the corrective action plan if required to do so by the cleanup oversight agency. Um, Cleanup oversight agencies must adhere to the 60-day time frame to ensure that sites are getting cleaned up promptly. And this also requires that responsible parties stay apprised of corrective action plan status and make changes as necessary if required to do so by that cleanup oversight agency. Will require that a feasibility study be conducted to evaluate alternatives for remedying or mitigating actual or potential effects of unauthorized releases. This study will need to evaluate the cost effectiveness um, of the cleanup as well as the relative size of its environmental footprint. We will require that responsible parties propose the most cost-effective corrective action plan that has the smallest environmental footprint while still adhering to the remediation objectives. This feasibility study will need to be designed to mitigate nuisance conditions and risk of fire or explosion. The change on this slide is that we're adding soil vapor to what the responsible party can begin cleanup of after that corrective action plan submittal. So the responsible party can begin cleanup of soil, water, or soil vapor 60 days after that corrective action plan was submitted, unless it's otherwise directed to do so in writing by the cleanup oversight agency. The responsible party must notify the cleanup oversight agency if the corrective action plan is no longer cost effective. As part of the closure preparation phase, the responsible party must activities that the responsible party must complete after the cleanup oversight program agency um, notifies that the UST is eligible for closure prior to being issued a closure letter um, pursuant to section 25296.10 and chapter 6.7 of Health and Safety Code. This indicates what the closure preparation phase entails and more consistently implement this section of Health and Safety Code. The COA must grant closure consistent with all applicable state policies for water quality control adopted pursuant to section 13140 of the Water Code. This is consistent with our low threat UST closure policy. The COA may require recording of a land use restriction as a condition of closure of a UST release case for a release of hazardous substance that is not petroleum. This was a gap in our current regulations that we are mending under the proposed regulations. We're adding that hazardous substance releases can also play into this. If the cleanup oversight agency determines that a land use restriction is necessary for protection of public health, safety, or the environment. All right. The last article are forms. Again, these are part of regulations. Let's talk first with our Appendix 3. This is our facility employee training certificate. We are requiring the facility name and address be on this form. We're also changing the initial date of training to just training date. And then off to the side of that, you will have your designated UST operator signature. We basically, each DO that provides uh, training for facility employees will need to have one of these Appendix 3s. As you can see here, there's only space for one DO and their ICC certification information on this form. That being said, if you look, I guess halfway down this slide, there's this checkbox for continuation pages. We added this page based on feedback um, received from people that use this form. And basically, you can add this Appendix 3.1 to the back of that, and that just carries over the bare minimum information from the previous sheet and is an entire sheet of individuals, or sorry, facility employee information and when they were trained by the corresponding designated operator. If there's a new DO or if there's a new ICC certification number, a new Appendix 3 will be required. Appendix 4 is our DO's visual inspection report form. You'll see here that we are requiring an email address, and this is consistent with some of our other forms as well. Email just seems to be a better or more quick way to get a hold of people these days, so we've added it to a number of our forms as well. We're also adding continuation pages to this. We're referring to sumps in our proposed regulations as containment sumps because there's different definitions between health and safety code and our regulations. Anytime we're talking about sumps that are required to be visually inspected, they will be discussed as containment sumps. We have Appendix 4.1 that is additional, like the Appendix 3.1 for facility employees. If your facility has a bunch of containment sumps, we've added this Appendix 4.1 where you can just continue to list your containment sumps as part of your DO visual inspection report. Same thing goes for our spill containment. Let's say you've got, 30 spill buckets. You can add this Appendix 4.2, and the same thing goes for under dispenser containment. This is our Appendix 4.3. If you remember from the beginning of our presentation, I discussed that we're moving away from documenting the last or the date of last performed testing and maintenance and changing it to the next required due date. Again, this change was made just because in the past, when we focus only on when testing was last due, that just creates this cycle of late testing. Moving forward, having this next due date be called out specifically should fix this issue. All right. Appendix 5 is our release detection equipment testing report form. This replaces our annual monitoring certification form and covers, all of our release detection testing. Page 2, we've updated the language on this page to have just easier readability and for clarification purposes. You'll see here we also discuss sumps as containment sumps consistent with our other forms. We also, in this red box at the bottom, we have a specific question asking to verify single-walled safe suction piping and whether or not that pipe contents will drain back to the UST if suction is released from the system. This will help, verify that those systems are actually safe suction, and that is a requirement to be performed every year. Like our other forms, we have continuation pages for Appendix 5 as well. This one being for if you have a bunch of sensors at your site that just don't seem to fit on one page, you can attach 5.1 to it. You'll also see on this page that we've added a box for confirming continuity. This is new. If you have, during your release detection certification, you will need to determine whether or not continuity passes or fails. Obviously, maybe there's a situation where it does not apply. Again, here's what that Appendix 5.1 looks like. Moving on to Section 7, this is for our line leak detectors. Similarly, language has been polished on this slide for more readability. We're also, we have this Section 5.2 if you have additional line leak detectors that don't seem to fit on one page. Here's what that continuation page for line leak detectors looks like. Section 8, we're getting rid of. This is for using a tank probe as monitoring equipment, and moving forward, you will no longer be able to use a tank probe for monitoring as far as release detection is concerned. You can still use it for other things like inventory control. Appendix 6 covers our spill containment testing. We've updated the language here to be consistent with other aspects of our draft regulation. Similarly, we have a continuation page for this if you have multiple spill containments that need to be tested. Here is our Appendix 8, our secondary containment testing report form. Again, making this front page consistent across all of our forms. We have continuation pages for this as well. For tank secondary containment testing, you can attach Appendix 8.1 if you've got multiple tanks that don't fit on this page. For piping secondary containment testing, you can attach Appendix 8.2 for the same reason. Here's our Section 8 that talks about containment sumps and UDCs. Again, you can attach Appendix 8.3 if you have additional sumps. We also have updated our language here for record-keeping purposes. Appendix 7, this is our overfill prevention equipment testing report form. We're adding requirements for this information for being consistent with our secondary containment testing report form. We've added lines for the tank manufacturer to, or we've added lines for specifying the tank manufacturer, this helping determine if that overfill prevention equipment is set to the proper height. Wording has been updated also to provide more visual space and make this form just easier to use. And we have this Appendix 7.1 if you have additional OPE. Here's what that 7.1 looks like. We're looking for tank capacity, inside diameter, and tank manufacturer as well. Here's our statement of understanding compliance form. We're using facility address and facility name in place of business name and business address for consistency. And we're also requiring email on here for similar reasons. We find that it's a much more effective way of getting a hold of people. We're getting rid of our designated UST operator ID form. If you'll recall at the beginning of our presentation, this is being retired in lieu of the SWR's next-gen data fields where you can enter this information instead. Again, that is just a better way to track this information and verify that the person performing the DO visual inspection is the correct person. All right, that's it for the proposed changes. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions after today about the Chapter 16 rewrite, I also have this link for our email listserv, which if you've got the notification to be here, you're likely already on this email listserv, but it's there in case you want to verify. I also have this QR code. This, if you scan this with your phone, it'll take you to our Chapter 16 info page where we have all of our latest Chapter 16 information.